Boring history for sleep. The worst jobs in the Roman Empire. You'd never want. The night air hung heavy over the ancient city of Rome, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of humanity packed too tightly together. Smoke from countless oil lamps mixed with the stench of refuse, creating a haze that clung to the narrow streets like a persistent ghost. It was the 14th year of Emperor Marcus Aurelius's reign, and the eternal city slumbered restlessly under a waning moon. In the imperial capital of nearly 1 million souls, most citizens had retired to their homes, or insulae, the towering tenement buildings that housed the common people. But for some, the work was just beginning. Quintus Servius pulled his worn cloak tighter around his broad shoulders as he made his way through the labyrinthine alleys of the Subura district. At 42, his body bore the marks of his former life as a legionary, a jagged scar across his left cheek, a permanent limp from a Parthian arrow that had shattered his knee, and calloused hands that had once wielded a gladius with deadly precision. Now those same hands gripped a simple wooden cart, its wheels creaking in protest against the uneven cobblestones. Another night, another denarius, he muttered to himself, the bitter taste of cheap wine still lingering on his tongue. Since his discharge from the legions 5 years ago, Quintus had fallen far from the respected soldier he once was. Tonight, as every night, he performed the work of a sterpicularius, a collector of corpses. The sterpicularius was among the most reviled professions in Roman society, beneath even the gladiators and prostitutes who at least provided entertainment or pleasure. Those who handled the dead were considered ritually unclean, tainted by the miasma of death. They were forbidden from living within the city walls and required to announce their presence with bells so that respectable citizens could avoid contact with them. For Quintus, a proud man who had once stood in formation before Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself, the humiliation burned deeper than any battle wound. As he turned into an especially narrow passage, the stench hit him like a physical force. In the flickering light of his oil lamp, he could make out the crumpled form pressed against the wall of a building. A young man, no more than 20, lay contorted in death, his face frozen in a grimace. By the quality of his tunic, or what remained of it, Quintus could tell he had been of the equestrian class, perhaps a merchant's son. Now he was just another body to be collected before dawn. "What happened to you, boy?" Quintus murmured, kneeling despite the protest from his damaged knee. The youth's neck bore the unmistakable bruising of strangulation, and his fine rings had been stripped from his fingers. Robbed and murdered, then. The usual story. With practiced movements, Quintus wrapped the body in a coarse linen sheet he carried for this purpose. As he lifted the corpse into his cart, he noticed something unusual, a small leather pouch that had fallen from the young man's tunic concealed beneath his body. Curiosity overcoming professional detachment, Quintus picked it up and loosened the drawstring. Inside was a clay seal bearing an insignia he recognized immediately, the crest of Senator Gaius Aurelius Cottus, a powerful man with close connections to the imperial family. More intriguing was the folded parchment sealed with wax. Breaking the seal, a crime for someone of his station, Quintus unfolded the letter and squinted at the text in the dim lamplight. His literacy, uncommon for a man of his class, was another remnant of his military service, where he had risen to the rank of optio. The message was brief but chilling. The philosopher emperor grows weak. The time approaches. The old gods demand blood. Quintus felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the night air. Political conspiracies were as common in Rome as fleas in a public bathhouse, but to possess such evidence was dangerous beyond measure. He quickly refolded the parchment and tucked it inside his tunic, close to his skin. The body in his cart was no longer merely another corpse to be disposed of. It was evidence of something sinister. As the sterpicularius continued his grim rounds, his mind raced. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, was indeed reported to be in declining health. Rumors from the palace spoke of his increasing reliance on physicians and his retreat into stoic, philosophical writings. The empire was stable, but restless, with constant threats from Germanic tribes along the northern frontier and persistent rumblings of discontent from the eastern provinces. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Quintus had collected 7 bodies, a typical night's work. The dead included 2 elderly paupers who had succumbed to age and exposure, a prostitute with marks of violence upon her, a child from the slums who had likely died of fever, and 2 drunkards who had apparently beaten each other to death in some tavern dispute. Along with the murdered young equestrian, they represented a cross-section of Roman society's most vulnerable. Quintus guided his cart toward the eastern edge of the city, where the vast burial ground spread beyond the walls. Most of his charges would end up in simple graves, or for those with no one to claim them, in common pits. The work of disposal would be handled by the fosseres, the grave diggers who worked under the supervision of the Libitinarii, funeral directors who operated from the Temple of Libitina, goddess of funerals. As he approached the Esquiline Gate, Quintus saw another figure trudging along the road ahead of him. Even in the grey morning light, he could tell it was a woman by her gait and the stola that draped her slender form. She carried a large bundle of fabric on her head, balanced with practiced ease. As he drew closer, the unmistakable acrid smell of stale urine reached his nostrils. She was a Phulonica, a laundress who used urine to clean garments. The woman turned at the sound of his approaching cart, and Quintus was struck by her appearance. Despite her humble occupation and the early hour, there was a dignity to her bearing that spoke of better origins. Her features, though tired, showed the classic lines of Greek ancestry: a straight nose, large eyes, and a well-formed mouth, currently set in a grimace of exhaustion. "Salve," she greeted him cautiously, stepping aside to let his cart pass. Her Latin carried the slight inflection of someone who had grown up speaking Greek. "Salve," Quintus replied, slowing his pace. Like him, she was among the untouchables of Roman society, those whose necessary professions rendered them objects of disgust and ridicule. "You're heading to the Phulonica early. The wealthy demand their garments returned by midday," she answered with a shrug, "and the collection vats must be emptied before they overflow." The Phulonica, or laundry, was infamous throughout Rome. Public urinals were positioned throughout the city, their contents collected daily for use in the cleaning process. Urine, with its natural ammonia, was the most effective agent for removing stains and restoring brightness to togas and tunics. The Phulones, the laundry workers, spent their days stomping garments in vats of the pungent liquid, their skin bleached and their nostrils permanently seared by the fumes. "I'm Livia," she offered after a moment, surprising Quintus with her willingness to converse. Most Romans would avoid even eye contact with a Sterpicularius. "Quintus Servius, formerly of the Legio II Adiutrix," he responded, the military designation slipping out from habit. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "A soldier fallen on hard times, then? The gods have a cruel sense of humor." "The gods or the men who claim to speak for them," Quintus replied, immediately regretting the hint of sedition in his words. Even among the lowest classes, one never knew who might be an informer. But Livia merely nodded, her expression suggesting she understood more than was safe to acknowledge. "We all serve Rome in our ways, soldier, some with swords, some with less glorious tools." She gestured to his cart of bodies, and then to her own bundle of urine-soaked fabrics. They had reached a fork in the road, Quintus continuing toward the necropolis, Livia turning toward the industrial district where the Phulonica operated. But before they parted, Livia glanced at the bodies in the cart and frowned. "That young man," she said, pointing to the murdered equestrian. "I saw him yesterday, alive." Quintus stopped abruptly. "Where?" "Near the baths of Trajan. He was arguing with a man in a senator's toga, an older man with a silver beard and a prominent nose. They seemed very heated." She hesitated, then added, "The older man made a gesture I've seen before, a signal to someone else." A signal for what? Quintus pressed, his interest piqued. Livia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. A signal to kill. Before Quintus could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats caused them both to shrink back against the side of the road. A mounted urban watchman appeared around the bend, his expression hardening with disgust as he recognized their professions. "Move along," he barked. "Decent people will be using this road soon." With a last, meaningful glance at Quintus, Livia hurried away toward the Follonica. Quintus resumed his journey to the necropolis, his mind now filled with troubling questions. The murdered equestrian, the cryptic message about the emperor, and now Livia's account of an argument with a senator. These pieces formed a mosaic whose pattern was both unclear and undeniably ominous. As he delivered his grim cargo to the funeral workers, Quintus made a decision. Instead of returning directly to his modest dwelling outside the city walls, he would seek more information, and perhaps, if the gods favored him, he would find Livia again. She had witnessed something important, and in the dangerous game of Roman politics, knowledge was as valuable as it was deadly. Little did he know that this day would mark the beginning of a dangerous journey through the underbelly of imperial Rome, forcing him to navigate not only the physical filth of the city's worst occupations, but also the moral corruption that festered beneath the gleaming marble of the world's greatest empire. The Follonica operated from before dawn until well after dusk, its distinctive stench announcing its presence long before the building came into view. Located in the artisans' quarter, it was a sturdy structure with high walls and numerous vats built into the stone floor. Large wooden frames stood in the courtyard, used for stretching cleaned fabrics to dry in the sun. Livia arrived to find the workshop already bustling with activity. Men and women, many of them slaves, stood ankle-deep in the yellowed liquid, rhythmically stomping on tunics and togas. Others scrubbed at stubborn stains with fuller's earth, a type of clay that helped lift dirt from the fabric. The air was thick with ammonia fumes, causing newcomers to gag, though the veteran workers seemed immune to the assault on their senses. "You're late," growled Porcius the overseer, a heavy-set man with perpetually watering eyes and mottled skin from years of exposure to the chemicals used in the cleaning process. "The vats need emptying, and there's a special order from the household of Prefect Tygidius Perennis. Must be ready by midday." Livia nodded silently, setting down her bundle of freshly collected urine from the public urinals, part of her morning duties. The thought of the prefect's name sent a chill through her. Tygidius Perennis was the Praetorian prefect, commander of the emperor's elite guard, and effectively the second most powerful man in Rome. His household's garments would receive priority treatment. As she began the nauseating task of emptying the used liquid from yesterday's work into the drainage channels that ran beneath the city, Livia's mind returned to the scene she had witnessed the previous day. The young equestrian had been arguing with Senator Cottus. She knew his face from the time she had delivered clean togas to his household. The signal she had mentioned to Quintus had been subtle but unmistakable, a particular gesture with 3 fingers that she had seen once before when a merchant who had offended the senator was later found floating in the Tiber. Livia had not told Quintus the complete truth. She had not merely seen the argument by chance. She had been deliberately following the senator. For weeks she had been gathering information, hoping to find something, anything, that might help her younger sister, Demetria. Demetria, just 17, had been purchased by Senator Cottus 6 months earlier to serve as a house slave. Initially, the position had seemed fortunate. Work in a wealthy household was preferable to many other fates that might befall a young Greek girl in Rome. But Demetria's letters, smuggled out by sympathetic kitchen slaves, had grown increasingly disturbing. She wrote of strange rituals conducted in the senator's private chambers, of visitors arriving in the dead of night, and of fellow slaves who disappeared after serving at these clandestine gatherings. Livia had been saving every sestertius she could spare, hoping to someday purchase her sister's freedom. But the encounter she had witnessed yesterday suggested a darker reality. Senator Cottus was involved in something dangerous, possibly treasonous. And now, a young man who had argued with him was dead. Dreaming of better days, Greek? Porcius's harsh voice cut through her thoughts. The vat won't empty itself. Livia returned to her task, her hands raw from the caustic liquid. At 25, she had spent nearly a decade in the Fulonica, having been sold into the profession after her family fell into debt in Athens. Her father, once a respected teacher of rhetoric, had died shortly after their arrival in Rome, leaving Livia and Demetria to fend for themselves in a city that viewed Greeks as both necessary and somewhat contemptible, useful for their culture and education, but never truly Roman. By midday, Livia's arms ached from wringing water from heavy fabrics and hanging them to dry. The summer heat intensified the smells of the workshop, creating a miasma that seemed to cling to her skin and hair. During the brief break allowed for a simple meal of bread and watered wine, she sat apart from the other workers, planning her next move. She needed to find Quintus again. The Sterpicularius had seemed intelligent and observant, qualities not always found in those who handled the dead. More importantly, he had shown interest in the murdered equestrian. Perhaps together they could discover what connection existed between the young man and Senator Cottus, and how it might relate to Demetria's situation. As the afternoon work continued, Livia's thoughts were interrupted by a commotion at the entrance to the Fulonica. Two men in the distinctive uniforms of the urban cohort, Rome's city police, strode into the workshop, their expressions a mixture of disgust at the surroundings and the rigid authority of those who wielded the power of the state. "We seek information about a murder," announced the taller of the two, his voice carrying over the splashing and stomping. "A young man of the equestrian order, found dead in the Subura this morning." The workers paused, exchanging nervous glances. Involvement with the authorities rarely ended well for people of their class. "Who found the body?" the guard continued, his gaze sweeping over the workers. "A Sterpicularius, most likely," Porcius replied with a shrug. "They collect the dead before dawn." The guard's companion, a stockier man with a pockmarked face, produced a small object. "This was found near the scene. Does anyone recognize it?" Livia's heart seemed to stop as she recognized the object. A small bone hairpin decorated with a tiny carved owl. It was Demetria's, a gift from their father years ago. What was it doing at the murder scene? With effort, she kept her expression neutral, though her mind raced with implications. Had Demetria been there? Was she somehow involved? Or was this a deliberate message, a warning to Livia herself that her interest in Senator Cottus had been noticed? "No one?" the guard asked again, his tone suggesting disbelief. "This is fine craftsmanship Greek work. Surely someone has seen it before." When no one responded, the guards exchanged a glance. "Very well," said the first. "If anyone recalls anything about a young equestrian arguing with a man near the baths of Trajan yesterday, there's a reward for information." As they turned to leave, the second guard added, "And a special message from the office of Prefect Perennis. Any rumors or gossip regarding members of the Senate should be reported immediately. Failure to report seditious talk is itself sedition." After they departed, the workshop remained quiet for several long moments, the usual sounds of splashing and stomping subdued. Everyone understood the implicit threat. The authorities were watching, listening. Porcius broke the silence. "Back to work. Those togas won't clean themselves, and the prefect's household is waiting." As Livia resumed her labors, a cold determination settled in her chest. She had to find Quintus before nightfall. Her sister was in danger, and somehow the dead equestrian, Senator Cottus, and perhaps even the Praetorian prefect were connected to her plight. The risk of seeking more information was great, but the alternative, abandoning Demetria to whatever fate awaited her in the senator's household, was unthinkable. The afternoon dragged on interminably, each hour marked by the changing angle of sunlight through the high windows of the Fulonica. Finally, as the workday drew to a close, Livia was assigned to deliver the cleaned garments to the household of Prefect Perennis, a task she usually avoided, but now welcomed as an opportunity to move freely through the city. With a large bundle balanced expertly on her head, she set out toward the Palatine Hill, where the homes of Rome's most powerful citizens overlooked the Forum. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city, and the streets teemed with people hurrying to complete their business before nightfall. Merchants were closing their shops, slaves were returning from errands, and the ubiquitous food vendors were doing a brisk trade, as workers sought a quick meal on their way home. Livia moved purposefully through the crowds, her mind racing. How could she find Quintus? Stipiculari typically lived in designated areas outside the city walls, considered too unclean to dwell among ordinary citizens. But Rome was vast, and searching the necropolis district would take time she didn't have. As she approached the more affluent neighborhoods, the streets widened and the buildings grew more impressive. Marble facades gleamed in the fading light, and the occasional sedan chair carried wealthy citizens who preferred not to walk the streets. Guards stood at the entrances to the grand homes, their presence a reminder of the vast gulf between Rome's elite and its common people. The household of Tigidius Perennis was among the most imposing, a sprawling complex with a columned entrance and walls adorned with elaborate frescoes visible through the open portal. Livia approached cautiously, conscious of her lowly status and the unmistakable odor that clung to her despite her best efforts to appear presentable. A steward met her at the servants' entrance, his nose wrinkling in distaste. "The laundry? Finally. Bring it through to the atrium. Quickly, girl, and try not to touch anything unnecessary." Livia followed him through a series of corridors, marveling despite herself at the opulence on display. Mosaic floors depicted hunting scenes and mythological figures, while the walls were painted in vibrant colors, showing landscapes and seascapes. Statues of gods and ancestors stood in niches, their marble eyes seeming to follow her progress. In the atrium, a fountain played musically, the sound of water creating a soothing backdrop to the hushed efficiency of the household slaves going about their duties. Livia was directed to place the clean garments on a table where another slave would sort and distribute them to their owners. As she carefully arranged the togas and tunics, she became aware of voices from an adjoining room, a study or library, judging by the glimpse she caught through the partially open door. The deep tones of men in serious conversation carried clearly in the quiet atrium. "The cult grows restless, Prefect. They demand action before the calends of September." Livia recognized that voice. Senator Cottus. Her hands froze in the act of straightening a toga, her attention now completely focused on the conversation. "Patience, Senator." This second voice was smoother, cultured, with the confidence of absolute authority. "The Emperor remains in the north with the legions. The time is not yet right, but the omens can be interpreted as we wish." The second voice, presumably Prefect Perennis, cut in. "We control the augurs, the haruspices. When we are ready, the signs will favor us." There was a pause, then Cottus again. "And the boy? His death is regrettable but necessary. He knew too much. The son of Flavius Scaevola was too curious for his own good. Like his father, he couldn't accept that Rome needs a stronger hand than that of a philosopher who writes meditations while the empire crumbles at its edges." Livia's heart pounded so loudly, she feared they might hear it in the next room. The murdered equestrian had been the son of Flavius Scaevola, a name she knew from Demetria's letters. Scaevola was another senator, one who had visited Cottus's home and left in apparent anger. "And the Greek girl?" Cottus asked. "She may have overheard something during Scaevola's last visit." "Your slave! Dispose of her. We can't risk—" The steward reappeared suddenly, his expression suspicious. "You're still here? Your business is concluded, Polonica." Livia straightened, affecting an air of deference. "Forgive me, Domine. I was ensuring the garments were properly arranged." The steward's eyes narrowed, but he merely gestured toward the exit. Go now, and tell your master that in future we expect prompter service." With a respectful nod, Livia backed away and followed the path they had taken earlier, her mind whirling with what she had overheard. A conspiracy against Emperor Marcus Aurelius, involving the Praetorian prefect himself. The murdered equestrian, Flavius Scævola's son, had discovered something, perhaps the same cult mentioned by the senator, and Demetria, her beloved sister, was now marked for death because she might have overheard a conversation between Cottus and the boy's father. As she emerged onto the street, the last rays of sunlight were fading from the sky. Night was falling over Rome, and with it came new dangers, but also opportunity. The Stipicularius, Quintus, would soon begin his grim rounds. She had to find him before it was too late. With determined steps, Livia headed toward the city gates. If she couldn't locate Quintus at his dwelling, she would search the streets he was likely to patrol. Somewhere in the vast, teeming city, a former soldier was pushing his cart of death, unaware that he had stumbled into a conspiracy that threatened not only the emperor, but the very foundation of Rome itself. The necropolis stretched before Quintus like a city of the dead, mirroring the world of the living with its streets, monuments, and social hierarchy preserved in stone. Grand mausoleums and ornate tombstones marked the resting places of the wealthy, while simple markers or unmarked graves housed the remains of the common people. Even in death, Rome maintained its rigid class distinctions. After delivering his night's collection to the funeral workers, Quintus had spent the day making inquiries about the murdered equestrian. His profession, despised though it was, gave him a certain freedom to move among both the living and the dead without attracting undue attention. People tended to look away from the Stipicularius, allowing him to observe much that others might miss. What he had learned troubled him deeply. The dead youth was Titus Flavius Scævola, son of Senator Flavius Scævola, known for his traditional Roman values and outspoken criticism of what he perceived as corruption within the imperial court. More interestingly, the elder Scævola was a staunch supporter of Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his philosophical approach to governance. Politics, Quintus muttered to himself as he prepared for another night of collecting the dead. Always politics. His modest dwelling, little more than a shack, stood at the edge of the necropolis, as befitted his untouchable status. Inside, the furnishings were sparse but meticulously maintained, a reflection of his military background. A wooden chest contained his few possessions, including the sword he had carried as a legionary, now kept more for sentiment than practical use. As dusk settled over the city, Quintus donned his work clothes, simple, sturdy garments that could withstand the rigors of handling the dead. From a hidden compartment in the floor, he retrieved the letter he had found on young Scævola's body. Throughout the day, he had pondered its meaning. The philosopher-emperor grows weak. The time approaches. The old gods demand blood. The reference to Marcus Aurelius as the philosopher-emperor was clear enough. The current ruler was known for his Stoic beliefs and had even written a series of philosophical meditations. But what old gods demanded blood? Rome's traditional religion involved animal sacrifice, not human blood, at least not officially. Yet rumors persisted of underground cults that practiced darker rituals, particularly those dedicated to foreign deities whose worship had been imported from conquered territories. Quintus had served on the empire's frontiers and had seen firsthand the strange beliefs that flourished there. Some legionaries secretly adopted these foreign practices, finding in them answers that Jupiter and Mars seemed unwilling to provide. Could such a cult have infiltrated the highest levels of Roman society? As he prepared his cart for the night's work, a sound from the road caught his attention. Footsteps, too light for a man, approaching his dwelling with purpose rather than the usual hesitant pace of those forced to visit the necropolis. Quintus reached for the knife he kept at his belt, a habit from his military days. "Quintus Servius?" a female voice called softly. "Former soldier of the 2nd Legion?" He recognized the voice immediately. "Livia the Fulonica," he replied, stepping into the doorway. "You're far from the laundry." In the fading light, her face appeared drawn with worry, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows around them. "I must speak with you about the young man in your cart this morning, and about much more." Quintus hesitated only briefly before inviting her inside. Social convention would consider it improper for a man and woman unrelated by blood or marriage to meet privately. But such niceties mattered little among the untouchables of Roman society. Once inside, Livia spoke quickly, relating what she had overheard at the house of Prefect Perennis. Quintus listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. "A conspiracy reaching to the Praetorian prefect himself," he said when she had finished. "And your sister caught in the middle of it. They planned to kill her." Livia's voice broke slightly, because she might have overheard something when Senator Scaevola visited Cottus's home. Quintus paced the small confines of his dwelling, his military mind assessing the situation. "We have little time then. If what you overheard is true, they plan to move against the Emperor before the calends of September. That's less than a month away." "But what can we do?" Livia asked, desperation evident in her tone. "We're nothing, a Stipicularius and a Fulonica. Who would believe us over the Praetorian prefect and a senator?" Quintus's expression hardened with resolve. "We find evidence, concrete proof of their plans, and we find allies, someone with enough authority to act on what we discover. And my sister, we rescue her first," Quintus said firmly. "Tonight, if possible, before Cottus can dispose of her." Livia's eyes widened. "Break into a senator's home. That's madness and treason." "So is plotting against the Emperor," Quintus countered. "And I've committed treason before, depending on who you ask." A shadow crossed his face, hinting at darker chapters in his past. "Besides, I know Senator Cottus's household. In my better days, I provided security for one of his dinner parties. The plan they formulated was desperate and fraught with danger. Quintus would begin his usual rounds as a Stipicularius, establishing his presence in the streets as normal. Meanwhile, Livia would return to the Fulonica to retrieve clean garments destined for delivery to Cottus's household the following morning. A legitimate reason to approach the senator's home. Under cover of darkness, they would meet near the senator's residence on the Caelian Hill. Using Quintus's knowledge of the household layout and Livia's ostensible reason for being there, they would attempt to locate and extract Demetria before she could be silenced permanently. "If we succeed," Quintus said as they prepared to part ways, "we'll need somewhere to hide. The authorities will search for a runaway slave, especially one from a senator's household." "I know a place," Livia replied. "There's an abandoned Mithraeum, a temple to Mithras, beneath the Fulonica. The previous owner was a devotee before the cult fell out of favor. Few know of its existence now." As Livia departed, blending into the growing darkness, Quintus prepared for his night's work with a new sense of purpose. For years, he had moved through Rome's streets as a shadow, collecting the discarded remains of humanity with mechanical efficiency. Now, for the first time since his discharge from the legions, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat, the clarifying focus that came with facing death and having a mission that mattered. Loading his cart with the tools of his trade, Quintus set out into the night. The streets of Rome grew quiet as decent citizens retired to their homes, leaving the thoroughfares to those whose business thrived in darkness. Prostitutes, thieves, drunkards, and those like himself who served necessary but despised functions. His first collection was a routine affair, an elderly man who had died in his sleep, his family too poor to afford proper funeral arrangements. As Quintus carefully wrapped the body, he maintained his usual demeanor of professional detachment, but his senses were heightened, alert for any sign that he was being watched or followed. Moving deeper into the city, he became aware of increased activity among the urban cohort. More guards than usual patrolled the streets, stopping people for questioning and peering into alleys and doorways. Something had the authorities on edge. Perhaps the murder of young Scaevola had raised concerns, or perhaps Prefect Perennis was using his influence to search for something or someone. By midnight, Quintus had collected 3 bodies and was navigating through the Subura district, heading gradually toward the more affluent area where Senator Cottus maintained his residence. The Caelian Hill was home to many of Rome's old aristocratic families, its elegant villas and gardens a stark contrast to the crowded tenements of the lower city. As arranged, Livia was waiting in the shadow of a small shrine to Mercury, the god of travelers and thieves, an appropriate patron for their night's work. She carried a bundle of cleaned garments, her usual delivery for the senator's household. "The street is heavily patrolled," she whispered as Quintus approached, the bells on his cart muffled with cloth to avoid announcing his presence. "Something has them agitated." "They're searching for someone," Quintus replied, securing his cart in a narrow alley. "Let's hope it's not us, yet." Together, they made their way toward the imposing walls that surrounded Senator Cottus's villa. Unlike the crowded insulae where most Romans lived, the homes of the wealthy were private compounds, often occupying entire city blocks with gardens, courtyards, and separate quarters for the numerous slaves who maintained them. "The servants' entrance is on the eastern side," Quintus murmured, drawing on his memory of the layout. "Less visible from the street and usually guarded by only 1 or 2 slaves rather than professional guards." Approaching with Livia, visibly carrying laundry, and Quintus following at a respectful distance, as might be expected if a female slave had enlisted help for a late delivery, they reached the servants' entrance without incident. As expected, a single drowsy slave manned the small door built into the larger gate. "Laundry for the household," Livia announced, her voice carrying just the right blend of deference and professional confidence. "Specially treated garments for the senator's morning appointments." The doorkeeper frowned. "At this hour, the steward will have your hide, girl." "The steward will have worse than my hide if the senator's new toga isn't ready for his meeting with Prefect Perennis tomorrow," Livia countered smoothly. "The Phalonica master sent me specially. There was a delay with the Tyrian purple dye." The mention of the prefect's name and the expensive purple dye, reserved for the highest ranks of Roman society, had the desired effect. The doorkeeper stepped aside, grumbling but unwilling to risk the senator's displeasure. Once inside, Quintus hung back, adopting the slouched posture of a common laborer while Livia took the lead, moving through the servants' quarters with purpose. The household was relatively quiet at this hour, with most slaves retired to their sleeping pallets and only a few night servants maintaining lamps or standing guard at key points. "The female house slaves would be quartered near the women's areas," Quintus whispered. "The Colina and Textrinum, kitchen and weaving room." Livia nodded, adjusting their course through the labyrinthine service corridors. They passed storerooms filled with amphorae of wine and oil, pantries stocked with provisions, and workshops where specialized slaves produced everything from furniture to cosmetics for the household's use. As they approached the women's quarters, a soft sound from a nearby doorway caused them to freeze. A figure emerged from the shadows, a young girl, perhaps 12, her thin arms wrapped around herself as if cold despite the summer night. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice barely audible. "Are you looking for Demetria?" Livia's breath caught. "Yes. Do you know where she is?" The girl's eyes darted nervously. "They took her, after the evening meal, the senator and his private guards, to the hypogeum." "The hypogeum?" Quintus questioned. "What hypogeum?" "Beneath the garden," the girl replied, "where they hold the rituals. None of us are allowed there, but Demetria was chosen to serve them tonight." Her voice dropped even lower. "Those who serve there don't always return." A cold weight settled in Quintus's stomach. The hypogeum, an underground chamber, suggested exactly the kind of cult activity he had suspected. Many wealthy Romans maintained private shrines or even small temples within their homes, but an underground chamber used for secretive rituals pointed to practices that Rome's official religion might not sanction. "Can you show us how to reach this place?" he asked the girl. She hesitated, fear evident in her expression, but finally nodded. "Through the peristylium, past the senator's private study. There's a door hidden behind a statue of Janus. But if they catch you..." She left the consequence unspoken. With the young slave as their guide, they moved deeper into the house, constantly alert for the approach of guards or household members. The peristylium, an open courtyard surrounded by columns, was beautifully maintained, with a central fountain and carefully tended plants. Moonlight filtered through the open roof, casting ethereal patterns across the mosaic floor. The senator's study was locked, but Quintus produced a slender metal tool from his belt, another remnant of his military service, where the ability to open locked doors in enemy territory was sometimes necessary. With practiced movements, he manipulated the mechanism until it yielded with a soft click. Inside, the room spoke of wealth and learning, scrolls arranged neatly in wall niches, a writing desk equipped with the finest materials, and art pieces from across the empire decorating the space. But it was the statue their guide had mentioned that drew their attention. A representation of Janus, the two-faced god of doorways and transitions, positioned against the far wall. "Behind there," the girl whispered, pointing. Quintus examined the statue carefully, noting how it seemed to be mounted on a track rather than fixed to the floor. With a firm push, it slid sideways, revealing a narrow doorway leading to a steep staircase descending into darkness. "Go back to your quarters," Livia told the young slave gently. "If anyone asks, you saw nothing." The girl nodded and slipped away, leaving Quintus and Livia facing the hidden passage. From below came the faint glow of lamplight, and more disturbingly, the rhythmic sound of chanting in a language neither recognized. "Ready?" Quintus asked, drawing his knife. Livia's expression was a mixture of fear and determination. "For Demetria, and for Rome." Together they began their descent into the Hippodrome, each step taking them closer to the heart of a conspiracy that threatened not only their lives, but the future of the empire itself. The air grew thick and oppressive as they descended the narrow stairs, the smell of incense and something more coppery, blood, filling their nostrils. The chanting grew louder, a guttural intonation in what Quintus recognized as a dialect from the eastern provinces, perhaps Syria or beyond. At the bottom of the staircase, a short corridor led to a heavy curtain of deep purple fabric embroidered with silver symbols, stars, crescent moons, and arcane signs that Quintus had seen in distant border regions where Roman authority blended with older, darker traditions. Moving silently, they approached the curtain. Quintus gently eased it aside just enough to peer into the chamber beyond. The scene that greeted them sent a chill through his battle-hardened soul. The Hypogeum was a large circular room, its walls covered in frescoes depicting strange deities with animal heads and multiple limbs, gods not of the Roman pantheon, but of Eastern mystery cults that had taken root in the cosmopolitan empire. Lamps, burning scented oil, cast flickering shadows across the space, creating an atmosphere of unreality. In the center stood an altar of black stone, its surface stained dark with what could only be blood. Around it, 12 figures in hooded robes formed a circle, their chanting directed toward a 13th figure who stood before the altar, arms raised in supplication, to a large statue that dominated the far wall. A bull-headed humanoid figure that Quintus recognized as Mithras, the soldier's god, but rendered with disturbing modifications that suggested a corruption of the traditional cult. At the foot of the altar, bound and gagged, lay a young woman whose features clearly marked her as Livia's sister. Demetria's eyes were wide with terror, her body trembling as the central figure, presumably Senator Cottus, raised a curved knife above her. "Blood of the innocent, open the way," he intoned in Latin, switching from the foreign chant. As foretold in the ancient texts, when the seventh seal is broken and the philosopher king falls, the true emperor shall rise, blessed by the old gods who thirst for sacrifice. The hooded figures responded in unison. Blood opens the way, death feeds the renewal. Quintus had seen enough. With a silent signal to Livia, he prepared to intervene. Their original plan of quietly extracting Demetria was clearly impossible now. Direct action was their only option. Using hand gestures learned in the legions, he indicated that Livia should create a distraction to the right while he approached from the left. She nodded, understanding instantly, and picked up a small oil lamp from a niche in the corridor. With a swift movement, she hurled the lamp toward the far side of the chamber, where it shattered against the wall, spraying burning oil across the nearest robed figures. Screams erupted as flames caught on their garments, and the orderly ritual dissolved into chaos. Quintus burst through the curtain, moving with the trained efficiency of a soldier. He reached the altar in seconds, his knife slashing through Demetria's bonds, while the cultists were still reacting to the sudden interruption. "Intruders!" Senator Cottus bellowed, his hood falling back to reveal his face contorted with rage. "Seize them!" Several of the cultists moved to obey, drawing daggers from beneath their robes. Quintus pushed Demetria toward Livia, who had rushed to her sister's side, then turned to face the approaching threat. The first cultist lunged clumsily, revealing his lack of combat training. Quintus sidestepped easily, using his opponent's momentum to send him crashing into the altar. The second proved more skillful, a soldier perhaps, or a trained bodyguard. Their blades met with a metallic clang that echoed through the underground chamber. "Get her out!" Quintus shouted to Livia, parrying another strike and countering with a slash that caught his attacker across the forearm. Livia hesitated, unwilling to leave him to face the cultists alone, but the need to protect her barely conscious sister won out. Supporting Demetria's weight, she began backing toward the exit. Senator Cottus, seeing his intended sacrifice escaping, abandoned dignity for direct action. "Stop them, you fools! The ritual must be completed." As several cultists moved to block the sisters' retreat, Quintus found himself surrounded, fighting with the desperate energy of a man who knew defeat meant death. His military training served him well. He moved efficiently, using the confined space to prevent his opponents from attacking simultaneously, but numbers were against him. A blade slipped past his guard, opening a gash along his ribs. Pain flared, hot and immediate, yet he fought on, determined to buy time for Livia and Demetria to escape. In the confusion, neither the cultists nor Quintus immediately noticed another presence entering the hippodrome. It was only when two of the robed figures suddenly collapsed, throats cut with surgical precision, that everyone froze in momentary shock. A tall figure stood in the doorway, blood-smeared blade in hand. As he stepped into the lamplight, Quintus recognized the insignia of the Frumentari, Rome's Imperial Intelligence Service, a secretive organization of spies and assassins who answered directly to the emperor. "In the name of Marcus Aurelius Imperator," the newcomer announced, his voice cold and official, "this gathering is declared treasonous. Surrender or die where you stand." Several cultists dropped their weapons immediately, the reality of their situation overcoming religious fervor. Others, including Senator Cottus, appeared less willing to yield. "You're too late," Cottus snarled. "The wheels are in motion. Perennis commands the Praetorians, and the emperor grows weaker by the day. Rome will return to the old ways, with or without this ritual." The Frumentarius smiled thinly. "Perennis has already been arrested, Senator. Your conspiracy has failed before it truly began." This news sent visible shock through the remaining cultists, many of whom now backed away from Cottus as if his very presence had become toxic. Taking advantage of the distraction, Quintus broke free from his opponents and made his way to where Livia stood protectively in front of her sister. "Are you both all right?" Demetria, still dazed but conscious, nodded weakly. Livia's expression was a complex mixture of relief, fear, and confusion at this unexpected turn of events. The Frumentarius approached them, his sharp eyes taking in Quintus's stance and bearing. You fight like a legionary, he observed. Quintus Servius, formerly Optio of the Second Legion, Quintus replied, maintaining a wary distance. Now a Sterpicularius. A significant demotion, the Frumentarius remarked dryly, though perhaps not unwarranted given your history. Before Quintus could respond, soldiers of the Praetorian Guard, evidently loyal to the Emperor rather than the now arrested Perennes, flooded into the chamber, securing the cultists and beginning a methodical search of the hypogeum. You've been watching them, Quintus realized, addressing the Frumentarius. How long have you known about this conspiracy? Long enough, came the cryptic reply, but suspicion is not evidence, and moving against a Praetorian prefect requires certainty. He gestured to the ritual chamber. This provides that certainty. Senator Cottus, now in restraints, glared at them with undisguised hatred. You understand nothing. The Empire weakens while the Emperor philosophizes. The old gods demand strength, not wisdom. The Frumentarius ignored him, turning his attention back to Quintus and the sisters. You three have inadvertently provided a great service to Rome. The Emperor will be informed of your actions. D. We want no recognition, Livia interjected quickly. Only our safety and freedom. A thoughtful expression crossed the Frumentarius's face. That may be arranged. But first, I would hear the full account of how you came to be involved in this matter. As the Praetorians led the cultists away, Quintus, Livia, and the still-shaken Demetria were escorted to a more private area of the senator's home, his tablinum, or office, where important business was typically conducted. There, under the watchful eyes of the Frumentarius and two Praetorian guards, they related the series of events that had brought them to the hypogeum. Quintus produced the letter he had found on young Scavola's body, now a crucial piece of evidence in the conspiracy. Livia described what she had overheard at Prefect Perennis's home, and Demetria, gradually recovering her composure, shared what she had witnessed as a slave in Cottus's household. The late-night meetings, the strange visitors, the disappearances of fellow slaves. So the cult aimed to assassinate the emperor and replace him with someone more traditionally Roman, the Frumentarius summarized, with Perennis using the Praetorians to seize power during the resulting chaos. They spoke of the calends of September, Livia added. That was their deadline for action. The Frumentarius nodded thoughtfully. The emperor is expected to return to Rome by then, having secured the northern frontier against the latest Germanic incursions. He studied the three unlikely heroes before him. You understand that what you've witnessed must remain confidential. State security depends on it. We understand, Quintus affirmed, but as the Phallonica mentioned, we seek only to live our lives in peace. Difficult given your professions, the Frumentarius observed. A Sterpicularius, a Phallonica, and a household slave who has witnessed a treasonous conspiracy. None of you can simply return to your previous lives. A heavy silence fell as the truth of his words sank in. Even if they escaped official punishment, Senator Cottus had allies who might seek revenge. Moreover, their involvement in breaking up the conspiracy had forever marked them. Perhaps, the Frumentarius continued after a moment, an arrangement can be made. The Empire has need of individuals who can move unnoticed through various levels of society, observing and reporting. Quintus's eyes narrowed with sudden understanding. You're recruiting us as informants? As Frumentarii? Not precisely, came the careful reply. The Frumentarii are a formal branch of imperial intelligence. What I propose is something more unofficial. You would continue your current occupations, but with additional duties and, of course, compensation. Spies, Livia stated flatly. You want us to be your spies. The Frumentarius smiled slightly. I prefer to think of it as civic service. You would report directly to me through secure channels. In return, you would receive protection, improved circumstances, and the knowledge that you serve Rome and its rightful emperor. For Quintus, the offer represented an unexpected chance at redemption. His discharge from the legions had come after he questioned orders that had led to a massacre of civilians in a frontier village, a stand that had cost him his career and nearly his life. Now he was being offered a way to serve Rome again, albeit in a very different capacity. For Livia and Demetria, the arrangement offered security and the chance to remain together. No small consideration for two Greek women alone in Rome. The alternatives, returning to the Polonica or seeking new employment with the constant fear of retribution, were far less appealing. "We need time to consider," Quintus said finally. The Frumentarius inclined his head. "Of course. You will be provided safe accommodation for the night. I expect your answer by morning." He rose to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Should you accept, your first assignment would be to investigate other members of this cult. We believe Cottus and Perennis were merely prominent members, not the leaders." After he departed, Quintus, Livia, and Demetria were escorted to a modest but comfortable room in a nearby imperial property. Guards were posted outside, ostensibly for their protection, though all three understood they were not yet fully trusted. "What should we do?" Demetria asked once they were alone, her voice still weak from her ordeal. Livia embraced her sister tightly. "Whatever keeps us safe and together." Quintus stood by the window, gazing out at the city that sprawled below. Rome slept uneasily, unaware of the conspiracy that had nearly changed its destiny. Dawn was still hours away, but already he could see the faint lightening of the eastern sky. A new day approaching for the Empire, and perhaps for themselves. "We accept his offer," he said finally. "For now, it gives us protection and purpose." "And if we find ourselves serving another corrupt master?" Livia challenged. Quintus turned to face her, his expression resolute. "Then we do what we did today. We stand for what's right, regardless of the cost." He touched the wound at his side, which had been treated by a physician summoned by the Frumentarius. "We've all seen the worst of Rome. Its filth, its cruelty, its disregard for those it considers beneath notice. Perhaps now we can see something better." Dai, as the first rays of dawn crept across the horizon, illuminating the marble temples and monuments that symbolized Rome's greatness, the three unlikely heroes contemplated their new path. From the despised depths of society's worst professions, they had risen to become unexpected guardians of the empire, moving unseen through its shadows, witnessing its secrets, and perhaps in their own small way, helping to guide its destiny. For Quintus the Stipicularius, Livia the Polonica, and Demetria the household slave, the worst jobs in the Roman Empire had led them to an extraordinary opportunity. In a world where status and birth determined one's fate, they had defied expectations and found meaning in the midst of degradation. And as Rome awakened to another day under the rule of its philosopher-emperor, they prepared to embrace their new roles as watchers in the darkness, protectors of the light. The conspirators would face Roman justice, swift and severe for crimes against the state. Senator Cottus, Prefect Perennis, and their followers would likely meet their ends in the arena or at the executioner's hand. But the cult they served might live on, its tendrils reaching into other powerful households, other provinces, waiting for another opportunity to restore what they considered the old ways. For now, however, Rome was safe. And in the complex tapestry of the greatest empire the world had ever known, three insignificant threads had proven unexpectedly crucial to its continued existence. Their story would never be recorded by historians or celebrated in public ceremonies, but in the secret annals of those who moved behind the scenes of power, the names of Quintus, Livia, and Demetria would be remembered as examples of how greatness could emerge from the most humble and most despised occupations in the Roman world. 3 months later, the autumn winds swept through Rome, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of cooler days. The city had changed little on the surface. The markets still bustled, the temples still received their daily offerings, and the vast apparatus of imperial administration continued to function with methodical precision. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, significant shifts had occurred in the wake of the failed conspiracy. Quintus Servius no longer pushed a corpse cart through the streets at night. He had been elevated, quietly, without official announcement, to the position of Libitinarius, a funeral director who operated from the Temple of Libitina. This role, while still associated with death, carried considerably more dignity than his former occupation. It also provided the perfect cover for his new clandestine duties. The small office behind the temple, where he now spent his days recording deaths and arranging for proper funerals according to the deceased's status and family wishes, had become a hub of information. People spoke freely around the Libitinarius, considering him a neutral figure. After all, death came to everyone regardless of politics or faction, and in their conversations they revealed much about the currents of power flowing through Rome. On this particular morning, Quintus was reviewing the funeral arrangements for a wealthy merchant when a hooded figure entered his office without announcement. He recognized the frumentarius immediately by his bearing, though the man's features remained shadowed. 3 more have been identified, the intelligence officer said without preamble, placing a small scroll on the desk between them. All connected to the Eastern temples, all with access to the imperial court. Quintus nodded, taking the scroll but not opening it immediately. And Livia's information? Confirmed. The cult's influence extends to Alexandria and Antioch. They call themselves the restorers of ancient virtue, though their practices have little to do with virtue, as most Romans would understand it. Since accepting their new roles as unofficial agents of imperial intelligence, Quintus, Livia, and Demetria had been methodically gathering information on the remaining members of the conspiracy. Their unique positions in Roman society, moving through spaces where the elite rarely bothered to disguise their true thoughts or actions, had proven invaluable to the frumentarius and his superiors. "There will be another gathering," Quintus informed him, lowering his voice though they were alone. "During the Saturnalia festivities, when the normal order is inverted and strange behaviors can be dismissed as holiday excesses." The frumentarius nodded thoughtfully. "A clever choice. The emperor will be participating in the public ceremonies, vulnerable despite his guards. Not just the emperor," Quintus added. "His son as well, Commodus." This news visibly concerned the intelligence officer. Marcus Aurelius had named his son Commodus as his heir, despite the young man's reputation for impulsiveness and fascination with gladiatorial combat, traits that worried many who valued the philosopher-emperor's steady governance. "Where did you learn this?" the frumentarius asked sharply. "From the master of the gladiatorial ludus, where I delivered the body of a fighter yesterday. He mentioned that Commodus has been visiting privately, training with the gladiators against his father's wishes. The cult sees him as malleable, a potential puppet should Marcus Aurelius be removed." The frumentarius absorbed this information with a grim expression. "We must move carefully. The remaining conspirators have grown more cautious since Cottus and Perennis were exposed. They watch for informants now." "Speaking of which," Quintus said, "Livia and Demetria have requested to meet you. They have information they won't entrust to me alone. Unusual." "Where?" "The Mithraeum beneath the old Phallonica." Midday. After the frumentarius departed, Quintus completed his morning duties before making his way across the city. Rome was preparing for winter, with merchants selling warm cloaks and households stockpiling firewood. The public fountains still flowed with fresh water brought by the magnificent aqueducts, a testament to Roman engineering that even the poorest citizens could appreciate. The Phallonica, where Livia had once labored, now stood empty. Its operations moved to a larger facility near the river. The abandoned building served as an occasional meeting place for the 3 agents and their handler, its reputation for foul odors ensuring that few people ventured near it willingly. Entering through a rear door, Quintus descended the worn stone steps to the underground Mithraeum, a temple to the soldier's god Mithras that had been adapted by previous owners of the property. The space retained its basic layout, a central aisle flanked by raised platforms where initiates would once have reclined during sacred meals, and an altar at the far end where rituals had been performed. Livia and Demetria were already there, as was the Frumentarius. But Quintus immediately sensed that something was wrong. The intelligence officer sat unusually stiffly on one of the stone benches, while the sisters stood slightly apart, tension evident in their postures. "Quintus," Livia greeted him, her voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for coming." "What's happened?" he asked, looking between them. "Show him," the Frumentarius ordered. Demetria stepped forward, producing a small object from the folds of her stola. It was a medallion of dark metal, inscribed with symbols similar to those they had seen in Senator Cottus's hypogum, but with subtle differences that suggested an even older, more esoteric tradition. "Where did you get this?" Quintus asked sharply. "From a visitor to the house where I now serve," Demetria explained. She had been placed as a household slave in the home of a wealthy equestrian family with connections to the imperial court, a position that allowed her to observe the comings and goings of Rome's influential citizens. He dropped it unknowingly. When I saw the symbols, I kept it rather than returning it. The Frumentarius leaned forward. The medallion bears the mark of a cult far older than the one Cottus and Perennis joined. It originated in Persia, was transformed in Egypt, and came to Rome with traders from the East nearly a century ago. They worship no gods recognized by Rome. Instead, they believe in primordial forces that existed before the gods themselves. "And their goal?" Quintus asked, though he suspected the answer. "Power," the Frumentarius said simply. "They believe Rome has been weakened by philosophy and mercy, Marcus Aurelius's defining traits. They seek a return to what they imagine was Rome's original strength: conquest, domination, rule through fear rather than law." Livia, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Tell him the rest." The intelligence officer's face hardened. "The man who dropped this medallion is Gnaeus Claudius Severus, a senator, a consul, and the father-in-law of Commodus himself." The implications were staggering. If the conspiracy reached into the imperial family through Commodus's wife's connections, then the danger was far greater than they had initially believed. The future of Rome hung by a thread even thinner than they had feared. "There's more," Demetria said softly. "Severus has been meeting regularly with the Praetorian officers who remained loyal after Perennis was removed, and he speaks often of Commodus's true destiny to restore Rome's martial glory." Quintus felt the weight of this revelation settle over them. What had begun as an investigation into a fringe cult had led them to the highest echelons of Roman power, and to a threat against not just the current emperor, but the empire's future trajectory. "We need evidence," the Frumentarius stated, his professional demeanor reasserting itself. "Suspicions and a medallion are not enough to move against a consul and imperial relative." "The Saturnalia gathering," Livia suggested. "If Severus is indeed the cult's leader, he will be present." "And how do we observe this gathering without being discovered?" Quintus asked. "They will be watching for spies now." A contemplative silence fell over the Mithraeum, broken only by the distant sounds of the city above. Then Demetria, the youngest and often the quietest of them, offered a solution that would place them all in greater danger than they had yet faced. "The cult requires servants for their rituals," she said. "Slaves who handle the sacrificial animals, prepare the sacred meals, maintain the fires. They choose them carefully, usually from foreign-born slaves considered less likely to understand the significance of what they witness." "You suggest we pose as these servants?" the Frumentarius asked skeptically. "Not you," Demetria clarified. "Your face is too well known in certain circles. But Quintus, Livia, and we could pass as slaves acquired specially for the occasion. The cult members never look closely at slaves. We're furniture to them, not people." The plan was audacious and fraught with danger, but as they discussed the details, it began to take shape as their best option. The Frumentarius would arrange for them to be sold to an intermediary who supplied slaves for special occasions among the wealthy. With their backgrounds as a soldier, a Phalonica, and a household slave, they could convincingly perform the menial tasks required while observing the cult's activities. If you're discovered, the Frumentarius warned, the Empire will deny any knowledge of your actions. You will face the same fate as the conspirators themselves. We understand, Quintus replied, speaking for all three. But Rome is worth the risk. As they emerged from the abandoned Fullonica into the autumn sunlight, each was absorbed in private thoughts about the path that had brought them to this moment. From the most despised professions in Rome to secret agents infiltrating a conspiracy against the emperor, it was a journey none could have imagined when they first crossed paths months earlier. Quintus watched Livia and Demetria as they walked slightly ahead of him, their heads close together in conversation. The sisters had flourished, despite the dangers of their new role. Livia had been established as a vestiplica, a household slave responsible for the care of her master's clothing, in the home of a wealthy merchant with connections throughout the Mediterranean. The position was vastly preferable to her former work in the Fullonica, though she sometimes joked that she couldn't escape her association with garments. For his part, Quintus had found an unexpected satisfaction in his work as a libitinarius, where once he had merely collected the discarded remains of humanity, he now helped families honor their dead with appropriate rituals and remembrances. It was, in its way, a form of healing, both for the bereaved and for his own battle-scarred spirit. As the three agents parted ways at a busy intersection, each returning to their respective cover identities, Quintus reflected on the strange turns of fate that had led them to become protectors of an empire that had once relegated them to its most despised occupations. In the weeks ahead, they would risk everything to preserve Marcus Aurelius's vision of Rome, a city governed by reason and law rather than superstition and fear. The worst jobs in the Roman Empire had prepared them uniquely for this mission. They had seen humanity at its most vulnerable and its most vile. They had endured the contempt of their fellow citizens while performing necessary services that no one else would undertake. And they had emerged from that crucible with a clear understanding of what truly mattered. Not status or wealth, but the chance to serve a purpose greater than themselves. As Quintus made his way back to the Temple of Libitina, he touched the medallion he wore beneath his tunic, not the cult's dark symbol, but the iron ring that had marked him as a soldier of Rome. Whatever came next, he would face it as he had faced the enemies of Rome on distant battlefields, with courage, with cunning, and with the absolute conviction that some things were worth dying for. The Saturnalia was approaching, and with it, a confrontation that would determine the future of the greatest empire the world had ever known. And three former outcasts, a Stapicularius, a Fullonica, and a household slave, now stood as the unlikely guardians of Rome's destiny. The Saturnalia festival transformed Rome like no other celebration in the calendar. For 7 days, beginning on the 17th of December, the rigid social hierarchy that governed daily life was symbolically inverted. Masters served their slaves at table, gambling was permitted in public, colorful clothing replaced the usual white togas of citizens, and a carnival atmosphere prevailed throughout the city. It was the perfect cover for activities that would, in normal times, attract unwanted attention. And for the cult that Quintus, Livia, and Demetria had been tracking, it provided an ideal opportunity to advance their plans against the emperor. The gathering was to take place at a villa outside the city walls, a secluded estate owned by a wealthy equestrian who had been identified as a cult member. Under the guise of a traditional Saturnalia feast, Rome's most powerful conspirators would meet to finalize their plans for reshaping the empire according to their vision. Through the Frumentarius' arrangements, Quintus, Livia, and Demetria had been hired as part of the large contingent of temporary slaves required for such an elaborate event. Their official duties were mundane: Quintus to assist with the slaughter and preparation of sacrificial animals, Livia to attend to the guests' garments, and Demetria to serve wine during the feast. On the day of the gathering, they traveled separately to the villa, each arriving with groups of other slaves sourced from various parts of the city. The estate was impressive even by Roman standards. Situated on a hillside with commanding views of the surrounding countryside, its grounds encompassing extensive gardens, a private bathhouse, and numerous outbuildings for specialized purposes. Quintus was directed to the rear of the property, where a small temple had been constructed, not dedicated to any traditional Roman deity, but designed with the same symbols they had seen in Senator Cottus's hypogeum. Here, animals would be sacrificed according to the cult's particular rituals before select portions were prepared for the feast. The head cook, a burly man with the scars of his profession on his forearms from years of working with fire and knives, barely glanced at Quintus. "You know your way around a blade?" he demanded. "I served in the legions," Quintus replied, adopting the deferential tone of a man fallen on hard times. "I can butcher whatever's needed." "Good. Start with these." The cook gestured to a pen containing several black rams, animals traditionally associated with underworld deities. "The throat must be cut from left to right, not the usual way, and save the blood in the silver bowls, every drop." Quintus nodded, hiding his disquiet at this departure from normal Roman sacrificial practices. Typically, blood was allowed to flow onto the ground or altar as an offering, not collected methodically as the cook described. It confirmed their suspicions that the cult's rituals had more sinister purposes than traditional worship. Meanwhile, Livia had been assigned to the villa's main building, where guests would disrobe before entering the baths that traditionally preceded a formal dinner. Her position would allow her to observe the arrivals and potentially overhear conversations as the conspirators relaxed in what they presumed was privacy. Demetria had perhaps the most dangerous role, as she would be present during the actual feast and subsequent discussions. As a wine-bearer, she would need to remain constantly attentive while appearing deaf and blind to the conversations around her, a skill she had perfected in her years of household service. As the short winter day began to fade and oil lamps were lit throughout the grounds, the first guests arrived. From his position near the sacrificial temple, Quintus observed the procession of litters and carriages depositing Rome's elite at the villa's main entrance. He recognized several senators, a high priest of Jupiter, wealthy merchants known for their conservative views, and military officers from the Praetorian Guard. Most concerning was the arrival of Gnaeus Claudius Severus, Commodus's father-in-law, accompanied by a younger man whom Quintus recognized with a shock, Commodus himself, the heir to the empire. The prince's presence confirmed their worst fears. The conspiracy had indeed reached into the imperial family. As darkness fell completely, Quintus completed his grim work with the sacrificial animals. The collected blood was taken by acolytes in dark robes to the small temple, where preparations for some ritual were clearly underway. He cleaned his hands and blade methodically, using the mundane task to calm his mind as he had before battle. When a messenger came seeking additional assistance in the main house, Quintus volunteered immediately. It was a chance to move closer to the heart of the gathering, to perhaps glimpse what Livia and Demetria had observed. The atrium of the villa had been transformed for the Saturnalia feast. Traditional decorations of greenery and ribbons adorned the walls, but Quintus noted darker elements interspersed among them, symbols matching those on the medallion Demetria had discovered, small figurines of unusual design, and black candles that gave off a strange, sweet smoke. The guests reclined on couches arranged around tables laden with exotic foods. Slaves moved efficiently between them, filling wine cups and offering delicacies on silver platters. Quintus spotted Demetria among them, her expression carefully blank as she poured wine for Severus himself. He was directed to help serve the main course, a roasted boar, traditionally associated with the Saturnalia. As he moved around the periphery of the gathering, he strained to catch fragments of conversation, to identify the principal figures, to understand the nature of their plans. "The philosopher grows weaker each day," one senator was saying to his companion. "The northern campaign has taxed his health severely." "And the sun is ready?" asked another voice, a military man judging by his bearing. More than ready. He chafes under his father's restraint. He yearns for glory, not meditation. Quintus's attention was drawn to Commodus, who reclined at the center of the gathering. The young man, barely 20, exuded a restless energy even in repose. His physical resemblance to his father was striking, but where Marcus Aurelius's features were typically composed in thoughtful dignity, his son's handsome face showed a volatile temperament beneath the surface. Severus leaned close to his son-in-law, speaking in tones too low for Quintus to overhear. Whatever he said caused Commodus to smile, a predatory expression that transformed his face into something harder, more dangerous. As the feast progressed, the atmosphere in the atrium shifted subtly. The conventional Saturnalia toasts and jests gave way to something more focused, more purposeful. Several older guests withdrew, accompanied by slaves carrying lamps to light their way to waiting litters. Those who remained, perhaps 30 in all, seemed to share a tense anticipation. Quintus caught Livia's eye across the room. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod, confirming that she too had sensed the change. Demetria continued her duties, now serving a special wine from black glass amphorae that had been brought from a sealed chest. Severus rose from his couch, commanding immediate attention. "Honored friends," he began, "as the Saturnalia reminds us of the golden age before Jupiter's reign, so too must Rome remember its own golden age, before philosophy weakened our purpose and mercy diluted our strength." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Severus continued, his voice gaining intensity. "Tonight, we take the first step toward restoration. The auguries have been read, the signs interpreted. The time approaches when Rome will shed its current skin like a serpent, emerging renewed and vital." He gestured, and slaves closed the doors to the atrium. Others brought forth the silver bowls of blood that Quintus had collected earlier. The atmosphere grew heavy with incense and anticipation. "First, we must seal our covenant," Severus announced, "as our ancestors did before the founding of the city itself." What followed was unlike any Roman ritual Quintus had ever witnessed. It borrowed elements from various mystery cults, but distorted them into something darker. The blood was mixed with wine in a large crater, a mixing bowl normally used for communal drinking at festivities. Each conspirator approached, spoke a pledge in a language Quintus didn't recognize, and drank from the mixture. Most disturbing was Commodus's evident enthusiasm as he participated. Where some of the older senators seemed to treat the ritual as a necessary political alliance, the young prince appeared genuinely enthralled by the mystical aspects, his eyes alight with a fervor that bordered on ecstatic. When the ritual was complete, Severus called for the slaves to withdraw, leaving only a few trusted attendants, including by design Demetria, to serve the conspirators as they moved to the concrete planning of their coup. Quintus and Livia, now excluded from the inner chamber, met in the kitchen, where slaves were cleaning up after the feast. They spoke in whispers, comparing observations while maintaining the pretense of work. "Commodus is fully part of this," Livia murmured, scraping leftovers into a container. "Not merely manipulated as we thought." Quintus nodded grimly. "The question is whether he understands what they truly intend. Does he know they plan to hasten his father's end?" I overheard Severus with one of the Praetorians. They spoke of the emperor's medicine and how it could be adjusted once they returned to Rome. Poison, then. A common method for removing inconvenient rulers throughout Roman history. Marcus Aurelius, with his stoic philosophy and indifference to personal comfort, would be an easy target, trusting his physicians implicitly and unlikely to question changes to his treatments. "We need to get word to the Frumentarius," Quintus said, "but we can't leave before Demetria." Their dilemma was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the atrium. Raised voices, the sound of furniture being overturned, then a scream that they both recognized immediately. Demetria. Without hesitation, Quintus grabbed a kitchen knife and moved toward the sound, Livia close behind. They found the atrium in chaos. Several conspirators were restraining Demetria, who had apparently been caught eavesdropping too obviously, or had somehow revealed her true purpose. "A spy!" Severus was shouting, his dignified facade cracked by rage. "Search the entire household! Find her accomplices!" Commodus stood to one side, his expression a disturbing mixture of excitement and cruelty. "Let me question her," he suggested, fingering the decorative dagger at his belt. "I've learned effective methods from my gladiator friends." Quintus assessed the situation with a soldier's calculating eye. There were too many armed men, including Praetorians, to attempt a direct rescue. Yet they couldn't abandon Demetria to torture and certain death. Livia clutched his arm, her face pale but determined. "The Frumentarius positioned men nearby. We need to alert them." It was their only hope. If they could escape and bring the Frumentarius's forces to the villa quickly enough, there might be a chance to save Demetria and expose the conspiracy before the plotters could disperse or destroy evidence. Taking advantage of the confusion as the household was searched, Quintus and Livia slipped away from the main building. The grounds were dark, with only occasional lamps marking the paths between structures. Guards were visible at the main gate, but Quintus led them toward the rear of the property, where the animal pens offered a less monitored exit. They had nearly reached the boundary wall when torches appeared behind them, accompanied by shouts of pursuit. Their absence had been noted, their connection to Demetria discovered. "Go," Quintus urged Livia, boosting her toward the top of the wall. "Find the Frumentarius. I'll delay them." Quintus, "Go," he insisted. "For Rome, Livia. For what's right." With a last anguished look, Livia disappeared over the wall. Quintus turned to face their pursuers, the kitchen knife gripped in his practiced hand. He was under no illusions about his chances against multiple armed men, but every moment he could delay them increased Livia's chance of escape and Demetria's chance of rescue. The first guard rounded the corner of a storage building. Torch held high. Quintus moved without hesitation, years of military training taking over. The knife found the gap between bronze armor segments, and the guard fell with barely a sound. Quintus relieved him of his gladius, a proper soldier's sword that felt familiar in his hand. Two more guards appeared, more cautious after spotting their fallen comrade. Quintus engaged them with the disciplined precision that had once made Roman legionaries the most feared soldiers in the world. He wounded one severely, but took a cut to his thigh in the process. The second guard fell back, calling for reinforcements. Knowing he couldn't hope to defeat all the villa's security, Quintus changed tactics. If he couldn't escape, he would create as much chaos as possible to cover Livia's flight and perhaps destroy evidence of the conspiracy. Grabbing the fallen torch, he set fire to the hay stored for the animals, then moved toward the main storage buildings where oil, wine, and other flammable materials were kept. The flames spread quickly, aided by the winter-dry vegetation and wooden outbuildings. Shouts of alarm replaced the calls of pursuit as slaves and guards alike turned their attention to fighting the growing blaze. Quintus used the distraction to work his way back toward the main villa. If he could reach Demetria, there might still be a chance to save her in the confusion. More practically, he needed to confirm which conspirators were present, to secure the evidence they had risked so much to obtain. The fire had achieved more than he'd hoped. The entire eastern section of the estate was now ablaze, the light visible for miles around. Such a conflagration would draw attention from neighboring villas, and perhaps even from the city itself. As he approached the main building, Quintus saw figures emerging in haste, the conspirators fleeing before they could be discovered at their treasonous gathering. He positioned himself in the shadows near the main path, watching and memorizing faces as they passed. Severus appeared, supporting Commodus, who seemed affected by the ritual wine. The senator's face was taut with fury as he hurried his imperial son-in-law toward a waiting carriage. Behind them came other key figures, military officers, wealthy merchants, priests of both traditional and foreign cults. There was no sign of Demetria. Quintus feared she had already been killed or was still being held inside. With most of the conspirators evacuating, he took the risk of entering the main villa to search for her. The atrium was empty of people, but still contained damning evidence. The ritual implements, the documents that had been consulted during the planning session, the symbols of their dark cult displayed openly now that the pretense of a normal Saturnalia feast had been abandoned. Quintus moved deeper into the building, checking rooms systematically, as he had been trained to do when clearing enemy structures. In a small chamber that appeared to be the villa owner's private study, he found what he sought: Demetria, bound to a chair, her face bruised, but her eyes alert. "Livia?" she asked as he cut her bonds. "Gone for help? Can you walk?" She nodded, though she swayed when she stood. "They questioned me. Wanted to know who we work for. I told them nothing." "Good girl," Quintus said, supporting her with one arm while keeping his sword ready in the other hand. "Now we need to—" He broke off as a figure appeared in the doorway, not a guard, but Commodus himself, apparently having slipped away from Severus. The young prince's eyes were unnaturally bright, his movements unsteady from the ritual wine, but the hunting dagger in his hand was held with dangerous purpose. "The Sterpicularius," Commodus said, recognition dawning on his face. "I remember you. You collected bodies after the gladiatorial games last year. You looked at me with disapproval when I gave the thumbs down." Quintus shifted to place himself between Demetria and the prince. "Your Highness is mistaken. I'm merely a slave hired for the feast." "No," Commodus insisted, his voice slurring slightly, but his gaze intense. "I remember faces, especially those who judge me. Who are you really? Who sent you to spy on us?" Outside, the fire was spreading toward the main building. Shouts and the crash of falling timbers created an apocalyptic backdrop to the confrontation. Smoke was beginning to seep under the doors and through windows. "Your Highness should leave," Quintus suggested, careful to maintain the deference due to imperial blood despite the circumstances. "The fire approaches. Your father, the Emperor, would be devastated to lose his only son and heir." The mention of Marcus Aurelius triggered a visible change in Commodus. His expression hardened, the boyish aspects of his face giving way to something colder, more calculated. "My father," he said, "prefers his books and meditations to his own son. He would rather write philosophical treatises than teach me how to rule. He teaches by example, Highness, through wisdom, justice, moderation." "Weakness," Commodus spat. "Rome was not built by philosophers but by warriors. My ancestor Augustus understood power. So did Trajan. So will I when the time comes." The implications were clear. Commodus was not merely a pawn of Severus and the other conspirators. He was a willing participant in their plans to restore Rome to a more authoritarian model. The philosophical guidance of Marcus Aurelius was to be replaced by rule through force and fear, with his own son as the instrument of change. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of armed men, not the villa's guards, but soldiers bearing the insignia of the Frumentari. At their head was the intelligence officer who had recruited Quintus, Livia, and Demetria months earlier. "Your Highness," the Frumentarius said smoothly, bowing to Commodus while his men secured the room. "What an unexpected honor. We received reports of a fire and came to offer assistance. The Emperor would be most distressed if any harm came to his beloved son." Commodus straightened, the mask of imperial dignity sliding back into place with practiced ease. "A fortunate arrival, Prefect. I was just about to apprehend these intruders who disrupted a private Saturnalia gathering." The Frumentarius glanced at Quintus and Demetria, then back to the prince. "Indeed, Highness. We will take them into custody immediately. Your presence here, however, might raise questions given the unusual nature of this gathering. Perhaps it would be best if you were not mentioned in official reports." It was masterfully done, offering Commodus a way to distance himself from the conspiracy while making it clear that his involvement was known. The young prince's eyes narrowed, calculating rapidly despite his intoxication. "A sensible suggestion, Prefect. I was merely visiting an acquaintance and became caught up in the emergency. I will take my leave now. An escort will ensure your safe return to the palace, Highness. Aye. After Commodus had been led away, the Frumentarius turned to Quintus and Demetria. Livia reached us just in time. Another few minutes, and this place would have been completely engulfed. The evidence, Quintus began, is being secured as we speak. Documents, ritual implements, the guest list, everything needed to expose the conspiracy. The intelligence officer's expression was grim, but satisfied. You three have done Rome a great service tonight, at considerable personal risk. Demetrius, still unsteady, leaned against Quintus for support. What happens now? The Frumentarius looked around at the study, where the flickering light of the approaching fire cast ominous shadows across walls decorated with the symbols of the cult. Now, he said, we use what we've learned to protect the Emperor and to prepare for the day when Commodus inevitably succeeds him. It was left unspoken that their discovery had revealed not just an immediate threat to Marcus Aurelius, but a longer-term danger to Rome itself. Commodus, when he eventually came to power, would bring with him the influences and beliefs of men like Severus, those who saw the philosophical governance of his father as weakness rather than wisdom. As they were led from the burning villa, Quintus looked back at the flames, consuming what had been a center of conspiracy against everything he had come to believe in. The fire seemed symbolic, purifying in one sense, but also a harbinger of the conflagration that might someday engulf Rome if men like Commodus and Severus had their way. Outside, Livia rushed to embrace her sister, her face streaked with tears of relief. As the three former outcasts stood together watching the villa burn, each knew that their work was far from over. They had begun as despised practitioners of Rome's worst professions, brought together by chance and necessity. Now they were bound by something deeper, a shared commitment to preserving the Rome of Marcus Aurelius against those who would transform it into something harder, crueler, and ultimately more fragile. The worst jobs in the Roman Empire had prepared them uniquely for this task. They had seen humanity at its most vulnerable and its most venal. They had endured contempt while performing necessary services, and they had emerged with an unshakable understanding that true dignity came not from status, but from purpose, from serving something greater than themselves, even when that service went unrecognized and unrewarded. As dawn broke over the 7 hills of Rome, casting golden light across temples and tenements alike, Quintus, Livia, and Demetria faced an uncertain future. But whatever came next, they would face it together, armed with the resilience forged in the crucible of society's most despised occupations and tempered by their newfound purpose as guardians of the soul of Rome itself. Epilogue. The conspiracy was never officially acknowledged. Senators and equestrians implicated by the evidence found at the villa quietly disappeared from public life, some to distant provincial appointments, others to sudden illness or unexpected retirement to country estates. Severus himself maintained his position, but found his influence at court significantly diminished, his access to Commodus restricted by new imperial advisors suggested by the Frumentarii. For Quintus, Livia, and Demetria, life acquired a new rhythm. Their cover identities became permanent roles, each offering opportunities to observe and report on different segments of Roman society. Their handler, the unnamed Frumentarius, met with them regularly, sometimes together, sometimes individually, collecting the threads of information they gathered and weaving them into the complex tapestry of imperial intelligence. 2 years after the fire at the villa, Marcus Aurelius died while on campaign against Germanic tribes. Commodus succeeded him peacefully, the potential conspiracy to hasten his ascension having been disrupted before it could take action. The new emperor initially showed respect for his father's policies and advisors, though signs of his different temperament were evident in his enthusiasm for gladiatorial spectacles and his increased personal participation in them. On a warm evening in the 5th year of Commodus's reign, Quintus sat in a modest tavern near the Forum, nursing a cup of wine while observing the ebb and flow of patrons. His position as a libitinarius had prospered, allowing him to expand his business to include a workshop that produced sarcophagi for middle-class Romans who aspired to more elaborate burials than their ancestors had enjoyed. He recognized Livia immediately when she entered, though few would connect the elegantly dressed matron with the Fulonica who had once stomped garments in vats of urine. Her cover identity had evolved as well. Following the death of her employer, she had been granted freedom in his will, arranged by the Frumentarius, and had used her savings to establish a small but respectable cloth importing business. "Quintus Servius," she greeted him with the warm familiarity of old friends. "Still among the living, I see." "And still dealing with the dead," he replied with a wry smile, gesturing for her to join him. "How fares the cloth trade?" "Well enough. My latest shipment from Alexandria arrived undamaged, which is more than I can say for my peace of mind." She lowered her voice. "Have you received the summons as well?" Quintus nodded slightly. Their handler rarely called for urgent meetings these days, preferring to maintain the appearance of normal lives for his agents. A summons suggested something significant had occurred. "Demetria?" he asked. "Already at the meeting place? She's concerned." Demetria had undergone perhaps the most remarkable transformation of the three. From household slave to educated secretary in the Imperial Archives, her keen intelligence and perfect recall had made her invaluable both to her official superiors and to the Frumentari network. Her position gave her access to correspondence and records that might otherwise have remained hidden from Imperial intelligence. After finishing their wine, Quintus and Livia made their way separately to the agreed meeting location, not the abandoned Polonica which had finally been demolished the previous year, but a small shrine to Minerva that was rarely frequented at this hour. The Frumentarius awaited them, along with Demetria. The intelligence officer had aged noticeably since their first meeting, his hair now more grey than black, lines of worry etched permanently around his eyes. The burden of protecting Rome from threats both external and internal had taken its toll. "My friends," he greeted them, dispensing with the usual formalities, "we face a crisis that may dwarf our previous concerns." He proceeded to outline developments that had been observed over recent months. Commodus, never as philosophically inclined as his father, had begun to show increasingly erratic behavior. He participated personally in gladiatorial combat, unheard of for an emperor, and had started referring to himself as the Roman Hercules, having statues of himself depicted with the divine hero's attributes placed throughout the city. More concerning was his renewed association with members of the cult they had thought dispersed after the Villa fire. Severus had regained influence, now joined by Cleander, a former slave who had risen to become Commodus's chamberlain and de facto ruler of the imperial household. "The patterns we observed before are re-emerging," the Frumentarius explained, but with a crucial difference. Before, the cult sought to replace Marcus Aurelius with a malleable Commodus. Now they appear to be encouraging the emperor's worst tendencies: his vanity, his thirst for adulation, his belief in his own divinity. "To what end?" Livia asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. "Chaos," Demetria said quietly. "I've seen the treasury reports. The empire's finances are being drained for spectacles, for golden statues of the emperor, for extravagant games. Meanwhile, the grain shipments from Egypt falter and the frontier garrisons go unpaid." The Frumentarius nodded grimly. "We believe the cult's ultimate goal is not merely to change who sits on the throne, but to fundamentally alter the nature of Roman governance. They seek to create such disorder that the people themselves will cry out for authoritarian control, for a return to rule by fear rather than by law." Quintus considered this assessment. It aligned with what he had observed in his position, where even the business of death provided insights into the empire's health. Funerals had become more ostentatious among those who could afford them, as if citizens sought to display their wealth while they still possessed it. Meanwhile, the number of pauper burials had increased as the urban poor felt the effects of economic mismanagement. "What would you have us do?" he asked finally. The frumentarius's expression grew even more somber. "Something I had hoped never to ask of you. We need evidence not just of the cult's existence, but of specific plans to undermine the empire. Evidence that could be used to approach those senators and praetorians who remain loyal to Rome's traditions rather than to Commodus personally." "You speak of deposing an emperor," Livia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of treason. I speak of saving Rome from an emperor who may destroy it through madness and manipulation," the intelligence officer countered. "The question is whether the greater loyalty is to the man who wears the purple or to the empire he was entrusted to protect." It was the most dangerous assignment they had yet been given. To gather evidence against an increasingly paranoid emperor and his inner circle would place them at risk of discovery not just by the cult, but by the extensive network of informers that Cleander had established throughout the capital. Yet as Quintus looked at his companions, at Livia's resolute expression and Demetria's quiet determination, he knew they would accept the mission. They had come too far, seen too much of both Rome's greatness and its potential for corruption, to abandon their roles now when the stakes were highest. "We began this journey as practitioners of the worst jobs in Rome," he said slowly. "Perhaps it's fitting that we now take on the most thankless task of all, saving the empire from its own emperor." Deal, the frumentarius nodded, relief visible beneath his professional demeanor. "Rome may never know what you've done for her, what you continue to do. But I know, and history will vindicate your choices, even if your names are never recorded in its annals." As they dispersed into the gathering darkness, each returning to their respective lives and covers, Quintus reflected on the strange path that had led them to this moment. From collecting corpses in the night to potentially shaping the fate of the greatest empire on earth, it was a journey no one could have predicted, least of all himself. The worst jobs in Rome had taught them to endure contempt, to observe without being observed, to find dignity in necessary work that others despised. Now those same skills might determine whether Rome continued as the beacon of civilization it had become under emperors like Marcus Aurelius, or devolved into the brutal military state that men like Severus envisioned. Whatever the outcome, Quintus, Livia, and Demetria would face it as they had faced every challenge since their paths first crossed, with courage born of having nothing left to lose, with determination forged in society's lowest depths, and with the unshakable conviction that even the most despised occupations could serve a purpose greater than themselves. For in the end, it was not the nature of the work that defined its worth, but the spirit in which it was performed. And in that truth lay the hope not just for their own redemption, but for the soul of Rome itself. The heat of summer pressed down on Rome like a physical weight, the air thick with dust, and the mingled odors of humanity. In the 8 years since Commodus had ascended to the throne, the city had changed in subtle but significant ways. More gladiatorial arenas had been constructed, drawing crowds to increasingly elaborate spectacles. Statues of the emperor as Hercules dominated public spaces, their gilded surfaces reflecting the sun with blinding intensity. And throughout the city, informers moved like shadows, listening for any hint of criticism against the divine ruler. Quintus wiped sweat from his brow as he supervised the loading of a marble sarcophagus onto a cart. His business had prospered despite, or perhaps because of, the uncertain times. Death remained a constant in Rome, and those with means increasingly sought to secure their legacies through elaborate burials, as if stone monuments could protect their memories from the emperor's periodic purges of enemies of the state. "Careful with that corner," he instructed the laborers. The family paid extra for the relief carvings. As the workers adjusted their grip on the heavy stone, Quintus noticed a familiar figure approaching through the workshop yard. Demetria moved with the practiced confidence of a free-born citizen now, her former slave status carefully obscured beneath the mantle of a respectable widow. At 30, she had blossomed from the frightened young woman they had rescued from Senator Cottas's hypogeum into a poised and capable agent. Quintus Servius, she greeted him formally, mindful of the workers nearby. "Might I have a moment of your time? I'm considering commissioning a memorial for my late husband's family, and I've heard your work is exemplary." It was a well-established cover for their meetings, the grieving widow consulting the respected funerary director. Quintus led her to his private office, a modest room lined with design sketches and samples of stone. Once the door was closed, Demetria's formal demeanor dissolved. "It's happening," she said without preamble, her voice taut with tension. "Cleander has overreached, and the people are turning against him. There was nearly a riot at the circus yesterday." Quintus absorbed this news with the steady calm that had served him well both as a soldier and as an intelligence agent. The grain shortage. Yes, and more. He's been selling public offices openly now, not even bothering with the pretense of merit. The treasury is nearly empty, the legions are demanding payment, and Commodus remains oblivious, focused on his gladiatorial games. Over the years, their mission had evolved from gathering evidence of conspiracy to monitoring the steady unraveling of imperial governance under Commodus. The emperor had descended from mere eccentricity into increasingly erratic behavior, renaming Rome Colonia Commodiana, claiming divine status, and executing senators on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. Cleander, the former slave who had risen to become the emperor's chamberlain, effectively ruled in Commodus's name, using his position to amass unprecedented wealth and power. The very corruption that the cult had claimed to oppose in Marcus Aurelius's philosophical governance had multiplied tenfold under his son's neglectful rule. "And Livia?" Quintus asked, concern evident in his tone. "Safe, for now. Her trading business gives her legitimate reason to maintain contacts throughout the city. She's been monitoring the mood in the markets and docklands." Demetria hesitated, then added, "The Frumentarius wants us to meet tonight. All three of us." This was unusual and potentially dangerous. Their handler had become increasingly cautious as Commodus's paranoia grew, preferring to meet them individually to minimize the risk of detection. "Where?" "The old cemetery on the Esquiline, the 3rd hour after sunset." Quintus nodded. The location was appropriate, isolated enough for privacy, but public enough that their presence could be explained if questioned. As a funerary professional, he had legitimate business in cemeteries at all hours, while Demetria and Livia could claim to be visiting family tombs with his escort. "I'll be there," he promised. "Now, shall we discuss this fictional memorial for your fictional husband's family, in case anyone is listening?" Demetria's smile didn't reach her eyes, but she played along, discussing marble types and carving styles in normal tones, while Quintus made notes and sketches. When she departed, the pretense of business concluded, he returned to his supervision of the workshop with a mind only partly focused on the task at hand. The years of clandestine work had taught him to compartmentalize, to maintain his cover identity while simultaneously processing intelligence and planning operations. Yet lately the strain had begun to tell. Rome under Commodus was a city of whispers and sudden disappearances, where today's imperial favorite might become tomorrow's executed traitor. The corruption that had festered beneath the surface during Marcus Aurelius's reign now flowed openly through the veins of the empire, poisoning every aspect of governance. As evening approached, Quintus closed his workshop and returned to his home, no longer the humble shack of a Sterpicularius, but a modest insular apartment befitting his improved station. He kept his living arrangements deliberately middle class, neither so poor as to be desperate, nor so wealthy as to attract unwanted attention. After a simple meal, he changed into inconspicuous dark clothing and made his way toward the Esquiline cemetery. The ancient burial ground had fallen into partial disuse as newer, more fashionable necropoli were developed, making it ideal for clandestine meetings. The older tombs, with their weathered inscriptions honoring long-forgotten Romans, stood like silent sentinels in the moonlight. Livia arrived first, materializing from between the monuments like a spirit. At 33, she retained the striking features that had first caught Quintus's attention years ago, though her face now bore the subtle lines of experience and responsibility. "Quintus," she greeted him softly. "It's been too long." Their work had increasingly kept them apart, each maintaining their separate cover identities and networks. Yet the bond forged during their first mission had endured, deepening over the years into something neither could quite define, more than friendship but constrained by the necessities of their dangerous profession. "You look well," he replied. "The cloth trade agrees with you. Better than urine vats, certainly." Her attempt at humor couldn't quite mask the tension in her voice. "Have you seen Demetria? She should be here soon. She visited me at the workshop today." They fell silent, alert to every sound in the quiet cemetery. Years of training had taught them the value of patience, of watching and waiting rather than exposing themselves unnecessarily. Demetria arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a cloaked figure they recognized as their frumentarius handler. The intelligence officer moved with a slight limp now, a souvenir from a too-close encounter with Cleander's personal guards the previous year. "My friends," he greeted them, his voice a rough whisper in the darkness. "Thank you for coming despite the risk." They gathered in the shadow of a large family mausoleum, speaking in hushed tones that wouldn't carry beyond their immediate circle. "Rome stands on the precipice," the frumentarius began without preamble. "Cleander's mismanagement has finally provoked public outrage beyond containment. Yesterday, during the chariot races, the crowd began chanting against him, demanding his removal. When soldiers were sent to disperse them, they held their ground. Will Commodus sacrifice him?" Quintus asked, knowing the emperor's pattern of abandoning advisors when they became liabilities. "That's the critical question. Our sources in the palace report that Commodus remains isolated, surrounded by sycophants who filter what information reaches him. He may not fully understand the extent of public anger." Livia, whose trading contacts gave her unique insight into the mood of the common people, spoke up. "The grain shortages are worse than reported. In the Subura, children are going hungry, while Cleander's warehouses remain full. His agents waiting for prices to rise further before selling." "And the Praetorians?" Demetria asked, always focused on the practical aspects of power. "Divided," the frumentarius replied. "The guard commander, Quintus Aemilius Laetus, has no love for Cleander, who has tried repeatedly to undermine his authority. But he's cautious, unwilling to move against the Chamberlain without assurance of the Emperor's support. The four conspirators, for that was what they had become, albeit in service to Rome rather than against it, considered the volatile situation. After years of gathering intelligence and building networks of informants, they now faced the culmination of their efforts. The question was how to use what they had learned to guide events toward an outcome that would benefit the Empire rather than merely replacing one corrupt official with another. "We need to get accurate information to Commodus," Quintus suggested. "Break through the filter of his courtiers." "Impossible," Demetria countered. "No one reaches the Emperor without Cleander's approval. And even if we could, Commodus has shown little interest in governance. He spends his days training with gladiators and rehearsing for his next public combat." The frumentarius nodded grimly. "Which leaves a more dangerous option. If Commodus cannot or will not act against Cleander, others might be encouraged to do so, with or without imperial approval." "You speak of removing Cleander by force," Livia said quietly. "Of assassination. I speak of survival. Rome's survival." The intelligence officer's voice hardened. "We have watched for 8 years, as the empire built by Augustus and maintained by generations of capable rulers has been systematically looted and mismanaged. The frontiers weaken, the provinces grow restless, and the heart of Rome itself seethes with discontent. He wasn't wrong. Each of them had witnessed the decay from their various vantage points. Quintus had seen how corruption infected even the sacred business of honoring the dead, with cemetery plots allocated based on bribes rather than proper religious considerations. Livia had observed how trade regulations were enforced or ignored depending on who paid the inspectors, and Demetria, from her position in the imperial archives, had documented the systematic theft of resources meant for public works and military maintenance. "What exactly are you proposing?" Quintus asked, the soldier in him requiring concrete details rather than vague intentions. The Frumentarius outlined a daring plan. Using their network of informants, they would ensure that accurate information about the grain shortages and public unrest reached both Commodus and key members of the Senate simultaneously. The timing would coincide with a planned gladiatorial exhibition where the emperor would be performing, ensuring maximum public attention. "The people already blame Cleander for their suffering," he explained. "If they protest while Commodus is present, directly appealing to him over his chamberlain's head, it creates an opportunity. The emperor can either respond to their demands by sacrificing Cleander or reveal himself as indifferent to their suffering." "And if he chooses indifference?" Livia asked. "Then the Senate and Praetorians will have witnessed it as well, and they may finally be motivated to act more decisively." The implication was clear. If Commodus proved unwilling to address even this level of crisis, it would strengthen the case for his removal, the option they had been carefully laying groundwork for over years of intelligence gathering. "It's dangerous," Quintus observed. "If the crowd turns truly violent, many innocent people could be killed in the chaos. More will die from starvation if nothing changes," Demetria said softly. "I've seen the projected harvest figures. Without immediate action, by winter the situation will be catastrophic." The four fell silent, each weighing the moral implications of what they were contemplating. They had begun as defenders of Marcus Aurelius's vision of Rome, a city governed by law and philosophy rather than tyranny. Now they found themselves plotting to manipulate events in ways that might lead to more violence and uncertainty. "There's something else you should know," the Frumentarius said finally. "Our original adversaries, the cult that sought to replace Marcus Aurelius's philosophical rule with a return to traditional Roman values, they've re-emerged, but with a different strategy." "How so?" Quintus asked. "Rather than opposing Commodus, they've begun to embrace his excesses, encouraging his identification with Hercules and his divine pretensions. They believe his behavior is actually serving their long-term goals by discrediting the very concept of imperial rule, preparing the ground for a return to what they consider a purer form of Roman governance." "The Republic?" Livia sounded skeptical. "Not precisely. They envisioned something closer to the early Principate under Augustus, military rule disguised with a thin veneer of traditional institutions. The difference is that they would control those institutions." It was a sobering thought. The conspiracy they had fought against for years had adapted, finding in Commodus's misrule an unexpected opportunity to advance their agenda. By allowing or even encouraging the emperor's worst tendencies, they were creating the conditions for their own rise to power when the inevitable collapse came. "So we face enemies on multiple fronts," Quintus summarized. "Cleander and his immediate circle of corrupt officials, Commodus himself, whose instability threatens the empire, and our old adversaries, who seek to exploit the chaos for their own ends." The Frumentarius nodded. "Welcome to Rome, my friends. Ever thus, since the days of the Republic." Despite the gravity of the situation, a grim smile passed between them, a moment of shared understanding that transcended their different backgrounds. From the despised depths of Rome's worst professions, they had risen to become players in the empire's highest politics, yet the fundamental nature of power remained the same: corrupt, contingent, and constantly contested. We proceed with the plan, then, the intelligence officer concluded. Each of you has your role. Demetria will ensure the relevant documents about grain supplies reach both the Emperor and key senators. Livia will use her trading contacts to spread accurate information about the situation in the markets and docklands. And Quintus, I'll monitor the mood of the people, Quintus finished. The dead tell no tales, but those who mourn them speak freely in my presence. With the details arranged, they prepared to depart separately, maintaining the compartmentalization that had kept their network secure for years. But as Demetria and the Frumentarius moved away into the shadows of the cemetery, Livia lingered for a moment with Quintus. "Do you ever wonder," she asked quietly, "what would have happened if we had remained what we were? If I had continued washing garments in urine and you had collected the dead without question?" Quintus considered the question seriously, as he did all things. "We would have lived smaller lives, perhaps safer ones, but Rome would be no better for our existence." And is Rome better now, with Commodus squandering his father's legacy and Cleander bleeding the empire dry? "Rome is more than its emperor," Quintus replied, echoing a sentiment he had often heard from the Frumentarius. "It has endured bad rulers before and survived. It will outlast Commodus too, if there are still Romans willing to serve the idea of Rome rather than merely its current master." Livia's expression softened in the moonlight. "You always did have a philosophical streak beneath that soldier's exterior. Perhaps Marcus Aurelius would have appreciated your thoughts. Perhaps, or perhaps he would have recognized another pragmatic realist, making peace with circumstances beyond his control." Quintus smiled slightly. "Go safely, Livia. The streets are dangerous these days. For some, others know how to navigate them." With a brief touch of her hand against his arm, a rare physical contact in their necessarily circumspect relationship, she disappeared into the darkness. Quintus remained for a few moments, standing among the tombs of Romans long dead. From this vantage point on the Esquiline Hill, he could see the city spread before him, its lamps and cooking fires creating a constellation of light that mirrored the stars above. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape, decisions were being made that would shape the destiny of millions across the empire. And he, who had once been merely a collector of corpses, now played a role in those decisions. The irony was not lost on him, as he made his way back toward his apartment, moving with the practiced invisibility that had served him well in both his former and current professions. The next days passed in a flurry of careful activity as the plan was set in motion. Demetria, using her position in the Imperial Archives, ensured that accurate reports about the grain shortages reached both Commodus's private secretary and influential senators who had shown concern for the public welfare. Livia activated her network of traders and merchants, spreading not rumors but documented facts about Cleander's manipulation of the grain supply. And Quintus, moving among the bereaved families who sought his services, listened and occasionally spoke, gauging and subtly influencing public opinion. The Frumentarius coordinated their efforts, maintaining the delicate balance between providing enough information to provoke action without revealing their own involvement. It was a dangerous game, made more so by the increased vigilance of Cleander's informers, who sensed the growing discontent and sought to identify its sources. On the appointed day, Rome awakened to the excitement of a special gladiatorial exhibition in which the emperor himself would participate, demonstrating his divine prowess as the Roman Hercules. Such displays had become more frequent as Commodus sought to reinforce his godlike image among the populace, fighting against carefully selected opponents who knew better than to win. The Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum, was filled to capacity, with spectators from all classes of Roman society present to witness their emperor's performance. The senatorial and equestrian sections gleamed with the white togas of the elite, while the upper tiers teemed with the common people, already restless from the summer heat and the ongoing food shortages. Quintus had secured a place in the equestrian section through his business connections, positioned where he could observe both the arena floor and the imperial box. Livia and Demetria were elsewhere in the vast structure, each with their own role in the unfolding events. The games began with the usual preliminaries: animal hunts, executions of condemned criminals, combats between professional gladiators. The crowd responded with the practiced enthusiasm of Romans accustomed to blood sport, but undercurrents of tension were visible to Quintus's experienced eye. In the upper sections, where the poorest citizens sat, there was muttering rather than cheering, and occasional shouts that had nothing to do with the spectacle below. Finally, the moment arrived for the emperor's appearance. Trumpets blared, and the crowd rose as Commodus entered the arena in the guise of Hercules, wearing a lion's skin over his head and carrying a club. At 31, he remained physically impressive, broad-shouldered and muscular from his obsessive training, his beard styled in the manner of his divine alter ego. From the imperial box, Cleander watched with the smug satisfaction of a man secure in his power. Surrounding him were other court favorites, all dependent on his patronage, all complicit in the exploitation of Rome for personal gain. The combat itself was a choreographed farce. Commodus faced a series of opponents, disabled veterans, and inexperienced gladiatorial students who made a show of fighting before allowing themselves to be defeated by the divine emperor. After each victory, Commodus paraded around the arena, accepting the adulation of the crowd with the practiced grace of a man who had come to believe his own mythology. It was during one of these victory laps that the carefully orchestrated demonstration began. From the upper sections, a chant emerged, not against Commodus directly, but against Cleander. Bread for the people, death to the thief, justice for Rome. The chant spread rapidly, gaining volume as more spectators joined in. Commodus paused in his circuit of the arena, his expression shifting from triumph to confusion. In the imperial box, Cleander leaned forward, suddenly alert to the potential threat. Guards moved toward the sections where the chanting was loudest, but found themselves facing not a few isolated troublemakers, but entire blocks of citizens united in their protest. The demonstration had been carefully planned to emerge simultaneously from multiple areas of the Colosseum, making it impossible to suppress quickly or quietly. Quintus watched as Commodus looked to his advisors for guidance. This was the crucial moment. Would the emperor recognize the legitimacy of his people's grievances, or would he react with the arbitrary cruelty that had increasingly characterized his rule? For a tense moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then Commodus made a gesture that would prove fateful. He turned his back on the protesters and signaled for the games to continue, effectively dismissing their concerns as unworthy of imperial attention. The crowd's response was immediate and dangerous. The chanting grew louder, angrier, no longer confined to specific complaints about grain, but expanding to encompass all the accumulated grievances of Commodus's reign. Some began to throw objects into the arena, pieces of bread symbolizing their hunger, but also stones and broken pottery that came dangerously close to the emperor himself. Praetorian guards rushed to surround Commodus, escorting him from the arena floor to the safety of the imperial quarters beneath the Colosseum. In the imperial box, Cleander was similarly hustled away by his personal bodyguards, his face rigid with anger and fear. What had begun as a controlled demonstration was rapidly evolving into something more volatile. As word spread beyond the Colosseum that the emperor had dismissed the people's concerns, crowds began to form in the surrounding streets. By midday, thousands were marching toward the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, their numbers growing as they absorbed bystanders and sympathizers. Quintus made his way through the turbulent streets, observing the mood of the crowd while maintaining a careful distance from its center. This was no longer their carefully managed plan, but a genuine popular uprising, unpredictable and potentially devastating in its consequences. He found Livia near the Forum, where she had been monitoring the reaction of the merchant class to the unfolding events. "It's spreading beyond our control," she reported tensely. "The dock workers have joined, and there are reports of grain warehouses being broken open in the Sabura." "Cleander's warehouses?" "Yes, for now. But if the hunger isn't satisfied quickly, they may not distinguish between legitimate businesses and corrupt ones." The implication was clear. Rome teetered on the edge of not just a political crisis, but potential urban warfare. The fragile peace maintained by the distribution of grain, the famous bread and circuses that kept the populace docile, was fracturing before their eyes. As afternoon stretched toward evening, rumors raced through the city. Some claimed Commodus had fled Rome entirely, others that he was preparing a massacre of the protesters. The truth, when it finally emerged, came from Demetria, who had maintained her position near the imperial archives throughout the chaos. "Commodus has been convinced to act," she informed Quintus and Livia when they reconvened at a predetermined location, a small temple to Vesta that remained peaceful amidst the turmoil. His sister Fadila gained access to him and warned that he would share the fate of Nero if he failed to address the people's demands. "And his response?" Quintus asked. "Cleander has been arrested, along with his closest associates. The emperor will announce the chamberlain's execution and the immediate distribution of imperial grain reserves." It was more than they had dared hope for. A decisive break between Commodus and the corrupt official who had dominated his administration. Yet all three agents understood that this was merely a tactical victory, not a strategic one. The fundamental problems of Commodus's rule, his instability, his detachment from governance, his divine pretensions, remained unaddressed. "The Frumentarius?" Livia inquired, "maintaining his position near the Praetorian prefect." Demetria replied, "The guard remains the key to long-term change." As night fell over Rome, an uneasy calm descended on the city. News of Cleander's arrest had pacified the immediate anger of the populace, and the promise of grain distribution had given hope to the hungry. But beneath the surface, fundamental shifts were occurring in the power dynamics of the empire. In the days that followed, Cleander was executed with the same arbitrary cruelty he had often employed against others. His vast properties were confiscated by the imperial treasury, though much of his wealth had already been hidden beyond reach. His supporters found themselves suddenly vulnerable, scrambling to distance themselves from their former patron. For a brief period, it seemed that Commodus might have learned from the crisis, might have recognized the need for more responsible governance. New advisors were appointed, reforms were announced, and the emperor made public appearances that emphasized his concern for his subjects' welfare rather than his own divine status. But Quintus, Livia, and Demetria, continuing their clandestine work under the Frumentarius' direction, observed troubling signs beneath this superficial improvement. Commodus's paranoia had been intensified by the public demonstration against his chamberlain. Where before he had been content to leave governance to corrupt officials while he pursued his gladiatorial obsessions, now he began to take a more direct role, not in responsible administration, but in identifying and eliminating perceived threats to his rule. The execution list grew longer each week. Senators, equestrians, military officers, anyone suspected of insufficient loyalty or of having sympathized with the protesters, found themselves facing accusations of treason. Property was confiscated, feeding the depleted treasury while creating a new class of impoverished nobles whose resentment simmered just below the surface. 6 months after Cleander's fall, the Frumentarius summoned his 3 agents to another meeting, this time in a quiet corner of the public baths during the least crowded hour. The location offered both privacy and the constant background noise of water and conversation that would mask their discussion. "The situation deteriorates," he informed them without preamble. "Commodus has replaced one form of misrule with another, arguably more dangerous. At least Cleander was predictable in his corruption. The emperor's purges follow no pattern except his own increasing paranoia. Quintus nodded grimly. His funerary business had seen an uptick in secretive nighttime burials. Families disposing of their dead without public ceremony, fearing that even mourning might be interpreted as political commentary. The people are afraid again, but differently now. Before, they feared hunger. Now they fear the imperial attention that might bring either favor or destruction. The military grows restless as well, Livia added. Her trading business had recently expanded to include supplying certain goods to the legionary camps outside Rome. The officers question whether the emperor's erratic behavior threatens the security of the frontiers. Demetria, always the most cautious of the three, had less to report. The imperial archives had been placed under stricter supervision, limiting her access to sensitive information. But what she had managed to glean was troubling. The treasury remains depleted despite the confiscations, and there are rumors that Commodus plans to rename the months of the year after his various titles. This last item, though seemingly trivial compared to executions and military unrest, represented a disturbing level of megalomania. The Roman calendar, with its months named for gods and traditions dating back to the Republic, was a cultural touchstone. To replace these ancient names with references to himself would be seen as an attack on Roman identity itself. "We've contained one crisis only to face another," the Frumentarius concluded. "And our original adversaries, the cult that seeks to restore traditional Roman values, have begun positioning themselves as the alternative to Commodus's increasingly unhinged rule." How so?" Quintus asked. "They approach disaffected senators and equestrians, offering protection and future influence in exchange for support when the inevitable crisis comes. They no longer speak of undermining the emperor, they simply wait, knowing his own behavior will accomplish what they could not." The four conspirators considered this development in silence. Their mission had evolved from protecting Marcus Aurelius against a specific threat to the more complex challenge of navigating Rome through the turbulent consequences of his son's rule. They had succeeded in removing Cleander, but the underlying rot in the imperial system remained. "What do we do now?" Livia finally asked, the question they all faced. The Frumentarius looked each of them in the eye, his gaze lingering on Quintus, who had been his first recruit from among Rome's despised professions. "We continue our work. We gather intelligence, we maintain our networks, we prepare for what comes next. But we must also begin to think beyond Commodus." "You speak of succession," Demetria said quietly. "The emperor has no heir." "Precisely. When, not if, Commodus falls, the question of who replaces him will determine Rome's path for generations. Will it be another military strongman, a senator backed by the cult, or someone who might restore the philosophical governance that Marcus Aurelius represented?" It was a daunting prospect. Their work had expanded from thwarting a specific conspiracy to potentially shaping the future of the empire itself. From the lowest, most despised occupations in Rome, they had risen to become silent guardians of its highest interests, players in a game of power whose consequences would echo through history. As they parted ways, each returning to their cover identity and daily responsibilities, Quintus found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him from collecting corpses in the night to helping determine who might wear the imperial purple. The worst jobs in Rome had prepared him and his companions for this unlikely role, teaching them to see what others overlooked, to endure what others could not, and to find purpose in service that brought no public recognition. Whatever came next, whether Commodus's reign ended in months or years, whether his successor brought renewal or further decline, Quintus, Livia, and Demetria would continue their silent work, guided by the vision of Rome they had first glimpsed through the wisdom of a philosopher-emperor. Not as the divine manifestation of power that Commodus imagined, nor as the militaristic empire of conquest that the cult envisioned, but as a civilization governed by reason, justice, and law, a light in a world too often darkened by cruelty and chaos. The worst jobs in Rome had given them a unique perspective on the empire they served, seeing it from below rather than above, understanding its foundations rather than merely admiring its gleaming facade. And in that understanding lay the hope that whatever trials awaited, Rome itself would endure, carrying forward the best of what human civilization had achieved while learning from its darkest errors. Historical note: Commodus would indeed continue his descent into increasingly tyrannical and erratic behavior. By 192 CE, his megalomania had reached such extremes that he renamed all 12 months of the year after himself, rechristened Rome as Colonia Commodiana, and declared his intention to assume both consulships for the following year, dressed as a gladiator. His end came on the last day of 192 CE, when a conspiracy organized by the Praetorian prefect Quintus Aemilius Latus, the imperial chamberlain Eclectus, and Commodus's mistress Marcia succeeded in assassinating him, first attempting poison, then employing a wrestler named Narcissus to strangle him in his bath. What followed was the Year of the Five Emperors, a period of civil war and instability that ultimately led to the rise of the Severan dynasty under Septimius Severus. The philosophical governance that Marcus Aurelius had embodied would not return, as Rome entered a period where military power increasingly determined imperial succession. As for Quintus, Livia, and Demetria, those unlikely heroes who rose from the most despised professions to serve Rome in its time of need, history records no mention of their names or deeds. Like countless others who worked in the shadows to preserve what was best in Roman civilization, their legacy lived on, not in monuments or inscriptions, but in the endurance of the ideas and institutions they had fought to protect. Their story reminds us that greatness often emerges from unexpected places, that dignity can be found in even the most degrading circumstances, and that the true measure of work lies not in its social status, but in its contribution to something larger than itself. In a world that often assigns worth based on wealth, power, or prestige, the Sterpicularius, the Phalonica, and the household slave stand as testament to the possibility that those society deems lowest may, in fact, rise to become its most necessary guardians.